A hard frost had settled over Mill Haven, West Virginia, before dawn, the kind that whitened every rooftop on Sycamore Street and made the air smell like iron. And Sergeant First Class Joel Mercer was only supposed to be dropping off a casserole dish. In the passenger seat, Rex lifted his nose and went still, ears forward, not a sound, which was always more alarming than a bark. Across the front lawn of the small yellow house at the end of the block, an elderly man in a bathrobe stood on the porch in the 31-degree cold, holding a single sheet of paper with both hands, staring at it the way a person stares at something they have read 4 times and still cannot make themselves believe. Behind him, through the front window, a woman's silhouette moved back and forth in the pale kitchen light. What that Marine found when he stepped out of his truck that morning would expose a scheme that a Millhaven landlord had been running for 11 years, and a promise made in a desert on the other side of the world that Hole Mercer hadn't known until that moment he had been carrying home. If stories about people who choose not to look away mean something to you, subscribe before we go any further. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. Joel Mercer had been a Marine for 14 years, which meant he had been many things in sequence. A 19-year-old from Clarksburg who joined because college felt abstract and service felt real. A rifleman, a staff sergeant, a man who had navigated 2 deployments in Helmand Province and 1 in Anbar with the specific competence of someone who had learned, at considerable cost, that preparation is the only real mercy. He had come home from his last deployment with both his legs and most of himself intact, which he counted as more than he was owed. What he had not come home with was an easy relationship with stillness. Civilian life moved at a pace that felt arbitrary to him, rushed in the wrong places, slow in the wrong places, with a kind of noise that didn't correspond to any actual urgency. He had taken a job at a veteran services nonprofit in Clarksburg and thrown himself into its paperwork and its field visits and its Tuesday morning case reviews with the same focused energy he had. Once applied to things that mattered considerably more. He was 38. He lived alone in a 2-bedroom house he had bought with his separation pay and a VA loan. He had a sister in Pittsburgh who called him every Sunday and pretended not to be checking on him, and he appreciated both the call and the pretense. He had been meaning to repaint the kitchen for 7 months. Rex was a German Shepherd, 4 years old, with a dark saddle marking and the intelligent, perpetually alert expression of a dog that had decided, somewhere in early puppyhood, that the world required close monitoring. He had been a military working dog before a leg injury ended his service career, and Joel had brought him home through a program that matched retired working dogs with veterans. They were not an obvious pairing. Rex was not a warm dog, not a dog that sought affection or performed loyalty. He was precise. He made assessments. When he decided, Joel was his person. The decision was not announced. It was simply implemented, and the evidence was behavioral. Rex slept across the doorway of Hoyle's bedroom every night, not inside the room, not curled on a bed, but across the threshold, positioned like a soldier at a post. When Joel was having a bad night, the kind that came without warning and sat on his chest until 3 in the morning, Rex came and pressed his full weight against Joel's side, steady and warm and immovable, and stayed there until whatever had come in the dark finally retreated. He did not whine. He did not ask for anything. It was simply present, which was, Joel had come to understand, the thing that mattered most and cost the most to give. The casserole dish had been his neighbor's idea. A woman from Joel's church, Agnes Polk, had asked him to drop it at the Beaumont house on Sycamore Street because she had a bad knee and the cold made it worse, and she knew Joel passed that way on his Tuesday drive. He had agreed without thinking much about it. He had loaded the dish into the passenger footwell and driven the 6 blocks and turned onto Sycamore at 7:45 in the morning. And that was when Rex lifted his nose and went still. The man on the porch was named Walter Beaumont. He was 82 years old, and he had lived in the yellow house on Sycamore Street for 31 years, which was essentially his entire adult life after 40. He had come to Millhaven from Beckley in 1992, following a job at the Millhaven machine shop that had turned into a career and then into a foreman's position that he had held with quiet competence until the shop closed in 2009. He was a short man, broad-shouldered in the way of someone who had done physical work for decades and retained the structure of it even when the work was gone. It had a particular habit of nodding while someone else was speaking. Not agreement, just attention, a physical signal that said, I am here and I am listening. And the people who knew him well said it was the most courteous thing about a man who was generally considered the most courteous person in any room he entered. His wife, Loretta, was 79. She had taught second grade at Millhaven Elementary for 22 years, which meant that approximately half the adults in Millhaven, under the age of 40, had, at one time, learned to read in her classroom. She was a small woman with quick eyes, and the particular efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing 26 7-year-olds simultaneously and found most adult problems comparatively manageable. She made excellent biscuits. She sang in the church choir, second soprano, and had for 30 years. She kept a bird feeder in the back garden that she restocked every Tuesday and Thursday, and she knew every bird that came to it by name. They had rented the yellow house on Sycamore Street. This was the central fact. They did not own it, had never owned it. And for 31 years, this had not been a problem, because the house had belonged to an old Millhaven family named Garrett, who had charged a fair rent and renewed the lease every year with a handshake and a cup of coffee until old Russell Garrett died in 2017, and his estate sold the property to a man from Charleston named Devin Pratt. Walter and Loretta had been given a new lease to sign. They had signed it. They were not people who questioned paperwork from lawyers, which was a trust that Devin Pratt had built his business model upon. The lease they signed contained a clause on page 7, paragraph 4, subsection B, in language that required a law degree to parse cleanly. That allowed the landlord to terminate tenancy with 30 days' notice if the property's assessed market value increased by more than 15% in any given calendar year. Property values in Millhaven had been rising since 2021. They had risen well past 15%. The notice on that piece of paper in Walter's hands gave him and Loretta until the first of the following month, 26 days. Joel got out of the truck. Rex came with him. No command, no leash, simply out and moving at Joel's left side, reading the porch, reading the man on it, reading the house. Walter looked up. His eyes were the pale blue of someone who had spent a lot of his life outdoors, and they had the expression that Joel recognized from field visits and home calls. The expression of a man who was holding himself together by concentrating very carefully on the next 4 seconds rather than the next 4 weeks. Morning, Joel said. Morning, Walter said. His voice was steady. It was still looking at the paper. Rex walked to the base of the porch steps, sat down, and looked up at Walter with the focused attention he reserved for things he had decided mattered. I was bringing a dish from Agnes Polk, Joel said. You okay? Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I don't know where we're going to go. He sighed in the tone of a man who has been thinking a sentence for a long time and finally said it out loud, not because he meant to, but because the weight of it had finally exceeded his capacity to hold it inside. He looked slightly surprised to have said it. Then he folded the letter carefully, the way you fold something you intend to keep even though you'd rather not. And he said, Come in. Lorette's making coffee. The inside of the yellow house was a specific and careful kind of warmth. 31 years of living showed in the accumulated texture of it, Walter's model trains on the shelf in the front room, Loretta's student photographs on the hallway wall in mismatched frames, a bird identification book spine broken from use on the kitchen windowsill, a braided rug in the entryway that had been there so long it had shaped itself to the threshold. The kitchen smelled of coffee and biscuits, and the particular warmth of a house that has been loved consistently and well. Loretta looked at Joel, then at Rex, then back at Joel. She was a woman who made rapid assessments and acted on them. She put a third cup on the table. Agnes Polk sent you, she said. She did, Joel said, though I think I'm glad she did. Loretta sat down. She put her hands flat on the table. You've seen the letter. Walter had it on the porch. She nodded once. 26 days, she said. I've been teaching in this town for 22 years. My grandchildren go to school 3 blocks from here. I have a bird feeder. She paused. I have a bird feeder and I have 26 days. She did not cry. She stated the facts with the precision of a woman who had learned that precision was the only useful response to an unfair situation. But her hands on the table were pressed flat in a way that suggested considerable effort. Joel picked up the lease. May I? Walter pushed it across the table. Joel read. Rex lay down under the table, his chin on his paws, his eyes tracking the room. The document was 14 pages. Joel read all 14. He read page 7 twice. He read subsection B 3 times. Then he set it down and was quiet for a moment. "How long ago did you sign this?" he said. 2017, Walter said. "When Pratt took over, did you have anyone review it before you signed?" Walter and Loretta exchanged a look that answered the question before either of them spoke. They were 82 and 79, from a generation that signed what lawyers put in front of them, because lawyers were educated people and the paperwork was the paperwork. Joel set the lease down. He looked out the kitchen window at the bird feeder. "I want to make a phone call," he said. "Have you ever known someone like Walter and Loretta? People who spent their whole lives doing everything right, contributing to a community, trusting the systems around them, and found out too late that someone had put a trapdoor in the floor?" If that story sounds familiar to you, if you're thinking of someone right now, tell me about them in the comments. They deserve more than silence. The phone call was to a woman named Sandra Okafor. An attorney, Joel, had worked with twice through the Veterans Services nonprofit, a housing specialist who had, in her 16 years of practice in West Virginia, developed a particular specialty in what she called predatory lease architecture. Joel described the clause. She asked 3 questions. Then she said, "Send me the document and tell them not to go anywhere." The second call was to a man named Hector Vega, who had served in Hull's unit in Helmand and now worked as a property records researcher for an insurance firm in Charleston. Hull asked him to look up every property Devin Pratt currently owned in Kanawha and surrounding counties and find any pattern in tenancy terminations over the past 8 years. Hector said he would have something by end of day. Hector called back in 4 hours. Devin Pratt owned 11 residential properties in 4 counties. In the past 8 years, he had issued market value termination notices to 9 of them. 7 of the 9 tenants had vacated within the 30-day window without challenging the notice. Of those 7, 3 were elderly couples, 2 were elderly single women, 1 was a disabled veteran. The remaining 2 were families with children under 12. 1 tenant had challenged. An attorney had reviewed the lease and identified a procedural defect in the notice, not the clause itself, which had held, but in the timing of the delivery, which had fallen outside the contractually required window by 4 days. That tenant had stayed. Pratt had not made the same procedural error since. Joel sat with this for a moment. He was in his truck, parked outside the Beaumont house. The frost had begun to lift off the rooftops across the street. Rex was watching a squirrel in the oak tree with the focused professional attention he brought to things that required patience. There are moments when you understand something you have known abstractly for years, that some people build systems specifically because systems are harder to fight than people, that the paperwork is not incidental to the harm, it is the instrument of it. Joel had spent 14 years in environments where the threat was visible and came from a direction. This was the other kind, the kind that came dressed in subsection B. He thought about a man named Elias Fontaine, his platoon sergeant in Helmand, who had grown up in Mill Haven, West Virginia. Elias, who had talked about Sycamore Street like it was a geographical fact of goodness in the world. The yellow house, the woman who fed the birds, the old man who waved from the porch. Elias, who had been killed outside of Sangin in 2011, in circumstances that Joel had stopped replaying in detail years ago because the details served nothing except the grief. Elias, who had a mother in Clarksburg, who still sent Joel a Christmas card every year, and a younger brother who had moved away, and a town that had given him its best childhood and then gotten on without him. He had not known, when Agnes Polk asked him to drop off a casserole dish on Sycamore Street, that this was the house Elias had described. He had not made the connection until Loretta said the street name and something shifted in his memory like a key finding a lock. He sat with that too. Then he put the truck in drive. Sandra Okafor arrived the next morning with a yellow legal pad and the controlled energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of case. She sat at the kitchen table with Walter and Loretta and the lease for 2.5 hours. Joel sat in the front room with Rex and the model trains and did not interrupt. I could hear Sandra's voice from the kitchen, steady, specific, occasionally asking Walter to point to a year or a date. And I could hear Loretta answering with the precision of a woman who had kept every document, every letter, every receipt. in a manila folder in the third kitchen drawer since 1992. Because you never knew, the manila folder turned out to be very important. Inside it was the original lease, signed with Russell Garrett in 1992. It contained a clause, handwritten in the margin, initialed by both parties, that granted Walter and Loretta first right of refusal on any sale of the property, at market rate, with 60 days to secure financing. Russell Garrett had put it there because he was a man who believed that people who kept a house for years had a particular claim on it that paperwork alone couldn't fully honor. Devin Pratt's 2017 Lease made no mention of this clause. It did not void it. It did not supersede it. It simply did not mention it, which was either an oversight or a calculation. And Sandra's expression when she read it suggested she knew which one. It was required to honor this, she said, from the kitchen doorway. When the estate sold, you had the right to purchase first. He bought this property without offering you that right. That makes the 2017 sale potentially voidable, and every lease he's issued since then built on a transaction that may not be legally sound. She paused. I need 2 days and a courthouse. Loretta said, we have 23 days left. Sandra said, I only need 2. Devin Pratt arrived on a Thursday morning. He drove a silver Mercedes and wore a coat that cost more than most people on Sycamore Street spent on a month of groceries. He came to the door with a property manager named Greg, who carried a clipboard, and an attorney from Charleston whose name Joel did not catch because the attorney did not introduce himself, which Joel noted. Sandra was already at the kitchen table. Joel stood in the front room. Rex was beside him. Walter opened the door. He was dressed in his good flannel shirt, the one he wore to church. Anne held the door open with the specific quiet dignity of a man who knew this was his home and was not going to pretend otherwise. Pratt came in without being invited to sit. He looked at Sandra. He looked at the papers on the table. His eyes moved to Joel and Rex and held there for a moment with the assessment of a man recalculating. Then he looked at Walter with the expression he had practiced. Regretful, responsible, a man doing an unpleasant but necessary thing. Mr. Beaumont, he said, I understand this is difficult. I want you to know this isn't personal. The market in this county, I know what the market is doing, Walter said. He said it quietly, without heat, and Pratt stopped. Rex moved, not fast, deliberately. He crossed from the front room doorway to the point between Pratt and Walter and sat down, and the sound that came from him was not a bark. It was low and continuous, felt more than heard, the sound of a decision being maintained rather than announced. His eyes were on Pratt. His body did not move. Pratt looked at the dog. Something shifted in his posture. Not fear exactly, but the recalibration of someone who has walked into a room and found it arranged differently than expected. Greg with the clipboard took a small step backward. Pratt's attorney said, the dog needs to be secured. Joel said, he's secured. He did not move. Neither did Rex. Sandra stood up from the table and placed 3 documents in front of Pratt. Pratt's attorney reached for them. He read the first page. He read the second. On the third page, he stopped and read a paragraph twice, and his face went through a change that was visible even from across the room. Pratt said quietly, what is this? Sandra sighed. The 1992 leases. The right of first refusal clause, initialed by Russell Garrett and Walter Beaumont on April 9, 1992. The West Virginia statute governing tenant rights under original lease terms, and a filing I made yesterday morning at the Kanawha County Courthouse questioning the legal validity of the 2017 property transfer. Given the failure to honor the prior contractual obligation, she paused. Your 30-day notice is built on a lease built on a transaction that may not have been yours to complete. The room was quiet. Rex did not stop growling. Pratt looked at Walter. He had been doing this for 11 years. He had been doing this to people who did not have a Marine and a housing attorney at their kitchen table. He had done it to 7 couples and families who had simply packed their things because the paperwork said they had to. It had built a system, and the system had worked because the people inside it were the kind of people who trusted systems. Walter Beaumont looked back at him. Walter was 82 years old, and he had worked underground for 20 years. Anne had been the most courteous man in every room he entered for his entire adult life, and he said in a voice that was perfectly level, We signed your lease because we trusted you. 6 words. The room absorbed them. Then Walter looked at the window and said nothing more, because nothing more was needed. A had said the true thing, the simple true thing, the thing that put the last 11 years in a sentence that Devin Pratt could not answer. The property manager with the clipboard was looking at his shoes. The unnamed attorney was looking at his documents. Rex watched Pratt from his position in the center of the room and did not relax, did not shift, did not look away. Joel read the lease aloud. He started at page 1 and read every page in a steady voice, without editorial comment, letting the language do what language does when it is read in the presence of the people it was designed to harm. He read subsection B. He read it twice. He read the fee schedules on page 11 that Pratt had buried in the renewal terms. He read the maintenance clause on page 12 that transferred all repair costs to the tenant after year 3. He read all of it, in the quiet of a Millhaven kitchen on a Thursday morning, with Loretta's hands flat on the table and Walter's chin up and Sandra Okafor's pen moving across her legal pad. When he finished, he set the lease down. He said, "That's the document you asked 2 people to trust." Pratt left without speaking. His attorney followed. Greg from property management paused at the door, looked back at Walter and said, "I'm sorry." Then he left too. Rex watched the door until it closed. Then he walked to Loretta's chair and placed his chin on the table beside her hands, and stayed there. And she put her palm on his head and pressed slightly, and the dog exhaled. What happened in the weeks that followed moved through Millhaven the way news moves through a town that is paying attention. Sandra's filing in Kanawha County triggered a review by the West Virginia Attorney General's office into Pratt's rental portfolio. 3 of the 7 tenants, who had previously vacated, contacted Sandra after Loretta's former student, now the managing editor of the Millhaven Gazette, ran the story on the front page without being asked. 2 had grounds for recourse. The right of first refusal clause opened a legal path for Walter and Loretta to purchase the yellow house at the 2017 assessed value. The credit union, whose branch manager had learned to read in Loretta's classroom 30 years ago, approved the financing in 48 hours. There are moments that feel less like coincidence and more like the long patience of a community finally being repaid. Joel came back the Saturday after the closing to help Walter fix the front porch railing, which Pratt's management company had refused to repair under the clause on page 12. They worked through the morning in the particular focused quiet of 2 men doing a physical task together. Rex slept on the porch steps in a patch of November sun. Loretta named every bird that came to the feeder while they worked, and the names were exact and specific in the way that genuine knowledge always is. At one point, Joel was fitting the last rail, and Walter said, without preamble, "You knew Elias Fontaine." Joel set down the hammer. "Platoon sergeant, 3 years." Walter nodded, the nod that meant, "I am here and I am listening." He talked about the street. Walter nodded. He called it the kind of place worth going back to. Walter was quiet for a long moment. The cold had the particular sharp clarity of late November in West Virginia. "He would have been 51 this year," Walter said. "I know," Joel said. They finished the railing. It held. Rex stretched in his sun patch without opening his eyes, and Joel stayed for lunch, and then stayed past lunch, and at some point in the afternoon stopped calculating how long he had been there, and simply sat in the warm kitchen of the yellow house while Loretta described a red-bellied woodpecker with affectionate precision, and the afternoon felt like something worth being present for. Joel Mercer did not drive past that porch. That was all. That was everything. This story is for every person who signed what they were told to sign and trusted what they were told to trust, and for everyone who has ever stood between a person and the system designed to move them. Is there a Walter and Loretta in your life? Someone who built a life in a place and is being told, in careful legal language, that the place is no longer theirs? Tell me about them in the comments. I read. Everyone. Let's fill this section with people whose names deserve to be said out loud. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here when the next one comes. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.